Racist nurse spills acid on black elderly woman. Not knowing her son owns the hospital, a medical professional's hate-filled actions backfire in the worst way when the woman's son steps forward. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. The fluorescent lights of Memorial Hospital's West Wing buzzed overhead as Nurse Beth Thompson made her rounds. Her shoes squeaked against the recently polished floor while she checked patient charts with mechanical precision. The night shift had just begun, and Beth's rigid posture reflected her equally inflexible mindset. At room 412, Beth paused to adjust her perfectly pressed uniform before entering. Inside, Mr. Martinez lay sleeping, his vitals steady on the monitor. Beth's lips tightened as she reviewed his chart, noting his limited English proficiency. "Another one who can't even speak proper English," she muttered under her breath, marking his chart with unnecessarily harsh strokes. A new nurse, Sarah, approached with a question about patient care. Mr. Martinez's family left some traditional remedies. They asked if we could dash. "Absolutely not," Beth cut her off sharply. "We follow proper medical protocols here. This isn't some backyard clinic." Her voice carried an edge that made Sarah step back. Beth's reputation for being difficult preceded her, but few understood the depth of her prejudices. In the hospital's community center, a different scene unfolded. Grace Washington, a 68-year-old woman with silver hair and dignity in her bearing, sat among a circle of people, sharing her experiences. The support group listened intently as she spoke about her involvement in the civil rights movement of the 1960s. "I marched with Dr. King," Grace said, her voice steady and clear. "I've seen this country change, but we still have work to do." Her hands, marked with age spots, gestured expressively as she described sitting at segregated lunch counters and facing water hoses. Despite the hardships, she recounted, her eyes sparkled with determination. The group members leaned forward, drawn in by her strength and wisdom. A young woman wiped tears from her eyes as Grace described teaching her children to navigate a world that wasn't always kind to them. "But we persist," Grace emphasized, "because dignity demands it." The peaceful atmosphere of the support group shattered when urgent voices echoed from the hallway. Beth had been rushing between patients, carrying a container of cleaning acid used for medical equipment sterilization. Her mind was occupied with complaints about the new diversity initiatives being implemented in the hospital. Grace was walking back to her room, having just finished her session. She moved slowly, using a cane for support, but her head remained high. Beth rounded the corner, distracted by her internal monologue about standards dropping and political correctness gone mad. The collision happened in slow motion. Beth's shoulder caught Grace's arm, and the container tilted. Clear liquid arced through the air, catching the fluorescent lights before splashing across Grace's right side. For a moment, silence hung in the air. Then Grace's scream pierced the quiet hospital corridor. The acid soaked through her clothes, beginning its cruel work on her skin. Beth stood frozen, the empty container slipping from her hands and clattering to the floor. Other patients and staff rushed toward the commotion. "Someone get help," a voice shouted. The acid was already leaving angry red marks where it touched Grace's skin. Through her pain, Grace's eyes met Beth's, and in that moment, Beth saw not just a victim of her carelessness, but a human being in agony. Medical staff converged on the scene, but Beth remained rooted to the spot. Her mind raced with implications, fear, and something else, a realization that this accident had deeper roots in her own prejudices. The emerge! NCY alarm blared overhead, its urgent rhythm matching Beth's racing heart. Grace lay on the floor, surrounded by responding medical personnel, her dignity intact even in pain. She didn't cry out again, but her breath came in sharp gasps as the emergency team worked to neutralize the acid and assess the damage. Beth backed away from the scene, her hands shaking. In her 20 years of nursing, she had never faced a situation quite like this. As chaos erupted around her, one thought crystallized in her mind. She had to hide what really happened. No one could know the truth about this accident. In the aftermath of the acid incident, Beth Thompson retreated to the nurse's station, her hands trembling as she pulled out patient files. The fluorescent lights seemed harsher now, illuminating every bead of sweat on her forehead. She had 20 minutes before the incident report would need to be filed. 20 minutes to alter the course of events. "I need everyone's attention," Beth announced to the nursing staff, her voice carrying an authority she didn't feel. "There was an unfortunate accident with a patient, but I'm handling the documentation." Her eyes scanned the faces of her colleagues, looking for any sign of defiance. "There's no need for additional witnesses or reports. Is that clear?" A young orderly who had witnessed the incident shifted uncomfortably. "But shouldn't we dash?" I said. "Is that clear?" Beth's voice cracked like a whip, making the orderly flinch. She began systematically altering documentation, changing the location of the incident, modifying the time, removing names of witnesses. Her movements were methodical, betraying years of experience with hospital bureaucracy. Meanwhile, across town, Derek Marshall sat in his modern office, reviewing plans for Memorial Hospital's new diversity initiative. As the recently appointed owner, he had ambitious plans to transform the institution. Stacks of proposals covered his desk, each outlining programs to improve healthcare access for underserved communities. His phone buzzed, then buzzed again, and again. "Mr. Marshall," his assistant's voice trembled slightly. "There's been an incident at the hospital. A patient was injured, severely burned by cleaning acid." Derek's hand tightened on the phone. "How serious?" "Second-degree burns, sir. The patient is stable, but what?" "There are inconsistencies in the initial reports. Some staff members are saying one thing, the official documentation says another." Derek stood, his chair rolling back against the wall. The diversity proposals scattered as he grabbed his coat. "I'm heading there now. Don't let anyone leave who was involved. And give me the security footage." At Memorial Hospital, Grace lay in a private room, her right side covered in bandages. The pain medication made the edges of her vision blur, but her mind remained sharp. A nurse, not Beth, adjusted her fore, carefully avoiding the bandaged areas. Derek arrived at the hospital, his tall frame casting a shadow in the doorway of Grace's room. He paused, taking in the scene before him. The sight of the elderly woman, wrapped in bandages, made his throat tight. "Ma'am," he said softly, approaching her bed. "I'm Derek Marshall, the owner of this hospital. I want you to know we're investigating what happened." Grace turned her head slightly, her eyes clear despite the medication. "Mr. Marshall," her voice was steady. "I hope you're ready for what you'll find." "What do you mean?" "This wasn't just an accident," Grace said, grimacing as she shifted position. "That nurse, she saw me as something less than human. I've seen that look before, back in the 60s. It hasn't changed much." Derek pulled up a chair, his expression grave. "Tell me everything." As Grace spoke, her words carried the weight of decades of experience with discrimination. She described the support group, the collision, and most importantly, the look-in, Beth's eyes before and after the incident. "The acid was an accident," Grace acknowledged, her voice growing stronger. "But what came before and what came after, that was choice. That was character revealing itself." Derek listened, taking notes, his jaw tightening with each detail. He didn't interrupt, didn't try to defend his institution. He just listened as Grace described the attempted cover-up she'd overheard through the thin hospital walls, the whispered conversations among staff, the subtle shifts in how she was treated after the incident. "Mr. Marshall," Grace concluded, looking directly into his eyes, "this hospital needs more than just new policies. It needs a reckoning." Derek stood, straightening his tie. "Ms. Washington, I promise you dash, Grace," she corrected him. "Call me Grace." "Grace," he repeated, his voice catching slightly. "I promise you, there will be consequences. We'll get to the bottom of this." As he turned to leave, Grace called out, "Mr. Marshall, sometimes the truth hurts more than acid. Are you ready for that?" Derek paused in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the hallway lights. "I have to be," he responded, unaware that the truth would soon test him in ways he never imagined. Derek Marshall moved through Memorial Hospital's corridors with purpose, his expensive suit at odds with the sterile surroundings. Staff members scattered as he approached, their hushed whispers following in his wake. He carried a tablet displaying security footage from the night of the incident, though crucial minutes were mysteriously missing. "I need to speak with everyone who was on shift that night," he announced to the head of HR. "And I mean everyone: orderlies, janitors, cafeteria staff. Someone saw something." The investigation revealed a pattern. Minority patients consistently waited longer for pain medication. Their complaints were more likely to be dismissed. Transfer requests from certain nurses happened more frequently when assigned to non-white patients. The data painted an ugly picture, one that had been hiding in plain sight. During his third interview of the day, a young Filipino nurse broke down. "We see it all the time, Mr. Marshall. But who do we tell? Beth Thompson has been here 20 years. She has friends in administration. We keep our heads down." In the break room, Beth sat alone, her coffee growing cold. Her carefully constructed world was crumbling. Through the window, she watched Sophia Martinez, a nurse with 5 years' experience, speaking with Derek. Sophia had witnessed the accident, and Beth knew she couldn't be trusted to stay quiet. "Sophia," Beth called out when the Latina nurse returned. "We need to talk." Sophia hesitated before following Beth into an empty patient room. The door clicked shut behind them. "You've been speaking with Mr. Marshall," Beth said, her voice low and controlled. "I hope you remembered our conversation about loyalty to our team." Sophia straightened her spine. "Loyalty? Is that what you call covering up assault?" "Assault?" Beth's laugh was sharp. "It was an accident. But people like you always want to make everything about race, don't you?" "People like me?" Sophia's voice rose slightly. "I've watched you for years, Beth. The way you treat certain patients, the comments under your breath, the accidental scheduling that puts you with mostly white patients. I provide excellent care to everyone," Beth snapped. "Just because I don't believe in lowering standards. Sophia, step closer. Like the standard of basic human decency? Grace Washington was a civil rights activist. She fought so people like me could wear this uniform, stand in this hospital. And you burned her with acid." "It was an accident." Beth's composure cracked. "I didn't mean to dash, but you meant to cover it up," Sophia countered. "You meant to threaten the staff who saw it. You meant to falsify records. Those weren't accidents. Beth, those were choices." Beth's face flushed. "You don't understand. If this gets out, my career dash. Your career?" Sophia shook her head. "An innocent woman is lying in a hospital bed with acid burns. And you're worried about your career? Listen to me." Beth's voice took on a pleading tone. "We could fix this. Together. Tell Marshall you were mistaken. That you didn't see clearly. I could put in a good word for you with administration." Sophia stepped back, disgust evident on her face. "Are you trying to bribe me?" "I'm trying to help you understand what's at stake," Beth insisted. "This hospital has traditions, standards. The way things are done the way things were done," Sophia corrected. "Times change, Beth. And this time, we're not keeping quiet." Beth grabbed Sophia's arm. "You can't dash. Let go of me." Sophia's voice was steel. "Right now, or I'll add assault of a staff member to the report I'm filing." Beth released her grip, stepping back as if burned. "You'll regret this. When the quality of care goes down, when standards drop, you'll remember this conversation." "No, Beth." Sophia moved toward the door. "The only thing dropping is the veil of respectability you've hidden behind. Mr. Marshall is going to know everything. The missing records, the threatened staff, the years of subtle discrimination. Everything." As Sophia reached for the door handle, Beth made one last attempt. "Please. I'm not a bad person. I believe in doing things the right way." Sophia paused, hand on the door. Grace Washington believed in doing things the right way too. That's why she sat at segregated lunch counters. That's why she marched for equality. That's why she still speaks up. Even now. The difference is her right way doesn't hurt people. The door opened and closed, leaving Beth alone in the empty room. Through the window, she watched Sophia walk directly to Derek's temporary office, her head held high. Beth sank into a chair, her world spinning. Years of careful manipulation, of maintaining what she called standards, were unraveling. And somewhere in the hospital, Grace Washington was gathering strength, becoming not just a victim, but a symbol of something much larger than one night's accident. Grace Washington's hospital room had become an unexpected center of resistance. Despite her injuries, she transformed her recovery space into a gathering place for patients, staff, and visitors who needed to share their stories. The institutional beige walls seemed warmer somehow, filled with the quiet murmur of honest conversations. "My daughter was in pain for hours," shared Mrs. Rodriguez, an elderly patient from down the hall who wheeled herself in daily. They kept saying it was nothing serious, that she was exaggerating. By the time they finally checked, her appendix had almost burst. Grace listened from her bed, her bandaged side a testament to her own experience. A young black orderly named Marcus leaned against the wall, nodding. They do that a lot, especially with pain management. Different standards for different folks. "Tell me more," Grace encouraged, wincing slightly as she adjusted her position. Her reporter's notebook, brought by a friend from her civil rights days, lay open on her lap. Each story was carefully documented, building a pattern that couldn't be ignored. A Jamaican nurse's aide shared how she was passed over for promotion 3 times, despite having more experience than the successful candidates. An Asian doctor described patient requests to see a real American doctor being quietly accommodated rather than challenged. "This isn't just about one incident with one nurse," Grace observed, her voice carrying the weight of decades fighting for justice. "This is about a system that lets these things happen, that looks the other way." Down the hall, Derek Marshall sat in his temporary office, surrounded by personnel files and incident reports. His phone buzzed, with another message from the hospital board, concerned about potential publicity. He ignored it, focusing instead on a photograph he'd found during his investigation. The image showed a younger Grace Washington, standing proudly in front of the hospital during its opening ceremony 30 years ago. She wore a civil rights organization t-shirt and held a sign advocating for equal healthcare access. The same determination he'd seen in her hospital room blazed in her eyes. Derek's hand trembled as he opened his wallet, pulling out a worn photograph. In it, a young boy sat on Grace's lap, both smiling at the camera. The boy had her eyes, her unwavering gaze. "Oh my God," he whispered, pieces falling into place. The familiar features, the shared determination, the way her voice stirred memories he couldn't quite place. He pulled up his mother's contact information on his phone, stored under her married name, Grace Marshall Washington. The walk to her room felt endless. Each step carried the weight of revelation, of understanding why this case had touched him so deeply. He paused outside her door, listening to her voice as she spoke to yet another group of people sharing their experiences. "We've all felt it," Grace was saying. "That moment when you're treated as less than human. But this time, we're not staying quiet. This time, we have evidence. This time, we have each other." Derek stepped into the room, his presence causing conversations to halt. The small gathering looked at him with mixture of hope and apprehension. The new owner who promised change, but came from the same system they distrusted. "Mom!" His voice cracked on the word. Grace looked up, her eyes softening with recognition and love. The room fell silent, understanding the magnitude of the moment. "I wondered when you'd figure it out," she said softly. "Sit down, son. We have a lot to talk about." The other patients and staff quietly excused themselves, leaving mother and son alone. Derek sank into the chair beside her bed, taking her uninjured hand in his. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "You needed to see it for yourself," Grace replied. "Not as my son, but as the owner of this hospital. You needed to understand what's really happening here, without personal feelings clouding your judgment." "Personal feelings?" Derek's grip tightened. "Someone hurt you. Someone under my employment hurt my mother." Grace's free hand covered his. "No, Derek. Someone hurt a patient. That's what matters here. The fact that I'm your mother just shows how deep this problem runs. It could have been anyone's mother, anyone's grandmother. And it has been over and over in ways less visible, but just as damaging." Derek looked at their joined hands. His success manicured fingers intertwined with her activist hands, scarred now by acid but still strong. "I'm going to fix this," he promised. "We're going to fix this," Grace corrected. "But not for me, and not for revenge." We're going to fix it because it's right, because every patient deserves dignity, because this hospital should heal bodies without breaking spirits. Outside the room, staff members who had overheard the revelation whispered among themselves. The news spread rapidly through the hospital corridors. The civil rights activist in room 302 wasn't just any patient. She was the owner's mother. In the pharmacy department, Beth Thompson heard the news and felt the last pieces of her world crumble. She sat heavily in her chair, finally understanding the true magnitude of her actions and the storm that was about to break. The morning after his discovery, Derek Marshall stood in Beth Thompson's office, his mother's medical file open on the desk between them. Early sunlight cast harsh shadows across the room, matching the tension in the air. "Explain this to me," Derek said, his voice controlled despite the anger simmering beneath. He pointed to discrepant IES in the incident report. "The security footage shows you with the acid at 9:45 p.m. Your report says 10:30 p.m. 3 witnesses place you at the scene. Your report lists none." Beth sat rigidly in her chair, her uniform perfectly pressed as always. "Mr. Marshall, in the chaos of emergency situations, times can become confused. I reported the incident as accurately as I dash. Don't." Derek's palm slapped the desk. "Don't sit there and lie to my face. You burned my mother with acid." Color drained from Beth's face. "Your mother? Grace Washington Marshall, the woman you've been trying to dismiss and diminish. The patient whose records you altered. The civil rights activist you accidentally doused with acid." Beth's hands twisted in her lap. "Mr. Marshall, you have to understand. It was a genuine accident. In my 20 years here, 20 years, Derek interrupted. 2 decades of subtle discrimination, of different standards for different patients. Did you think nobody noticed? Did you think the patients didn't feel it? I maintain the highest standards of care," Beth protested, but her voice wavered. "Every decision I've made has been in the hospital's best interest." "The hospital's best interest?" Derek's laugh was bitter. "Let's talk about the hospital's interests. Let's talk about the pattern of minority patients waiting longer for pain medication on your shifts. Let's discuss the coincidental scheduling that kept you mainly with white patients. Should we review the complaints that mysteriously disappeared from your file?" Beth's professional facade cracked slightly. "Those are unsubstantiated accusations. This hospital has traditions, standards of care, or standards of discrimination." Derek pushed away from the desk, pacing. "You know what's interesting? Since this investigation began, dozens of patients and staff have come forward. They're not afraid anymore. They're talking about experiences stretching back years." Outside Beth's office, a crowd had gathered for a community meeting in the hospital's main lobby. Grace's voice carried through the building's PA system, clear and strong despite her injuries. "Healthcare is a right, not a privilege," she declared. "And that right includes being treated with dignity, regardless of your skin color, your accent, or your background." Beth flinched at Grace's voice. She's turning this into something it's not. One accident. Derek's voice rose. The accident was the acid. Everything else, the cover-up, the intimidation, the years of subtle discrimination, those were choices. Your choices. Through the office window, they could see more people arriving for the community meeting. Local news vans parked outside, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky. "Your mother is destroying everything we've built here," Beth said, desperation creeping into her voice. "This hospital has a reputation. Yes, it does," Derek cut in. "A reputation for excellent care, if you're the right kind of patient. That ends now." Grace's voice continued through the PA system, sharing stories collected from her hospital room. Each account struck Beth like a physical blow, dismantling her carefully constructed justifications. "These aren't just stories," Grace was saying. "These are lives. These are your neighbors, your community members, and they deserve better." Beth stood, smoothing her uniform with trembling hands. "Mr. Marshall, please. My record here is exactly the problem," Derek finished. "Your record of maintaining a system that hurt people while hiding behind policy and procedure. A system that nearly killed my mother. I never meant to get caught." Derek moved toward the door. "That's the only thing you regret, isn't it? Getting caught?" Beth sank back in her chair, the weight of 2 decades of choices pressing down on her. Through her window, she watched as more community members arrived, many carrying signs demanding change. Grace's voice rose again, stronger now. This isn't about punishment. This is about transformation, about making this hospital what it always should have been, a place of healing for everyone. Derek paused at the office door. You have a choice, Beth. You can resign quietly, or I can launch a full investigation that will expose everything. Either way, your time here is over. As he left, Beth remained seated, watching through her window as the community gathered below. She saw faces she'd treated differently over the years, heard voices she'd dismissed, felt the weight of countless small cruelties she'd justified as maintaining standards. In her hospital room turned command center, Grace continued speaking, her words carrying through the hospital halls like a cleansing wave. Change comes from confronting truth, no matter how uncomfortable. And the truth is, healing can't happen in an atmosphere of hate. Beth's carefully constructed world wasn't just crumbling anymore. It was being dismantled, brick by brick, story by story, truth by truth. And she was finally beginning to understand the magnitude of what she'd done. Late into the night, Derek sat in his office surrounded by stacks of personnel files, patient complaints, and internal memos. The evidence of systemic discrimination wasn't just scattered incidents. It was woven into the hospital's very procedures. His laptop displayed emails dating back years, each one revealing another layer of institutional bias. Mr. Marshall, his assistant, appeared at the door. I found those archived incident reports you requested. And there's something else. She placed a thick folder on his desk. Inside were dozens of complaints that had never made it to official records. Notes and margins revealed a pattern. Patient possibly exaggerating symptoms, cultural tendency. Consider language barrier before accepting pain assessment. Recommend transfer to county facility, maybe more appropriate setting. Derek's hands clenched as he read Beth's signature at the bottom of many reports. But she wasn't alone. Other names appeared. Administrators, department heads, senior staff members. This wasn't just one prejudiced nurse. It was an entire system working to maintain what they called traditional standards of care. In the hospital's chapel, Beth sat alone in the dim light. Her uniform, usually pristine, was wrinkled from hours of sitting. On her phone, she scrolled through news coverage of Grace's community meetings. Video clips showed patients sharing stories she had dismissed, justified, or simply ignored over the years. A memory surfaced. Her first year as a nurse, watching her mentor accidentally misplace a Hispanic patient's pain medication request. Some people just want attention, the senior nurse had said. You have to maintain standards. Beth had nodded, absorbed the lesson, and spent 20 years perpetuating it. The chapel door opened. A young black nurse entered, then stopped short at the sight of Beth. I'm sorry, she said quickly. I'll come back later. Wait, Beth called out. Please. I won't bother you. The nurse hesitated, then took a seat in the far corner. Beth watched her bow her head in prayer, remembering how many times she'd questioned this same nurse's competence, doubted her reports, subtly undermined her authority. Beth's phone buzzed with a text from another longtime nurse. We need to stick together. This will blow over. But would it? Should it? Meanwhile, Grace and Derek had converted a conference room into an action center. Community leaders, hospital staff, and patients worked together, documenting experiences and drafting proposals for systemic change. Look at this, Grace said, pointing to a chart. Mortality rates, adjusted for age and condition, show a clear disparity. It's not just about feelings or perceptions. People are dying because of these biases. Derek nodded grimly. I found internal emails discussing these statistics. They knew. They all knew. A knock at the door interrupted them. Sophia entered, carrying more files. You need to see these, she said. Beth wasn't just covering up the acid incident. She's been altering records for years. And I found evidence that administration has been helping her. Grace reached for the files with her uninjured hand. How deep does this go? All the way to the board, Sophia replied. I found correspondence about maintaining the hospital's traditional patient base, coded language for keeping certain patients away. Derek stood, pacing the room. We're not just fighting individual prejudice. We're fighting an entire culture. That's exactly right, Grace said, her voice firm. And that's why this moment is so important. We have a chance to change not just policies, but hearts and minds. Back in the chapel, Beth's phone displayed another news alert. Memorial Hospital faces investigation over systemic discrimination claims. Her own face stared back at her from the screen, caught in an unguarded moment of contempt while dealing with a patient. The young nurse rose to leave. At the door, she paused. "You know," she said quietly, "I used to admire you. Your efficiency, your confidence. Then I realized what it cost other people." Beth looked up, meeting the nurse's eyes for perhaps the first time. "I never thought of myself as... I always believed I was doing what was best for the hospital." "The hospital," the nurse repeated. "But what about the patients?" "All of them." As the door closed behind her, Beth's carefully constructed justifications began to crumble. In her mind, she heard the screams from the acid incident, saw Grace's dignified strength in the face of pain, felt the weight of thousands of small cruelties justified in the name of standards. That night, she dreamed of faces, patients she'd dismissed, colleagues she'd undermined, lives she'd impacted through what she now recognized as prejudice masked as professionalism. She woke in a cold sweat, her certainty replaced by a growing horror at what she'd become. The next morning, as she prepared for another day of investigations and accusations, Beth caught her reflection in her bathroom mirror. For the first time, she didn't see a dedicated professional maintaining standards. She saw someone who had lost her humanity in the name of tradition. The hospital's main conference room had never held such a diverse crowd. Every chair was filled, with people standing along the walls and spilling into the hallway. Board members in expensive suits sat uncomfortably next to maintenance staff, nurses, and community members. The air conditioning struggled against the heat of so many bodies, matching the mounting tension in the room. Derek stood at the podium, Grace seated beside him in a wheelchair, her bandages still visible beneath her clothing. The projector screen behind them displayed damning statistics, emails, and incident reports. "For years," Derek began, his voice steady, "Memorial Hospital has operated under what we call traditional standards of care. Today, we're going to see exactly what those traditions have cost us." He clicked through slides showing mortality rates broken down by race and ethnicity. Charts revealed disparities in pain medication administration, waiting times, and complaint resolution. Each image drew gasps or murmurs from the crowd. "Mr. Marshall," interrupted board chairman Richard Wilson, rising from his seat. "These statistics can be interpreted in many ways. You're painting a picture that doesn't reflect doesn't reflect what?" Grace's voice cut through the room. "Doesn't reflect how I lay burning from acid while a nurse tried to cover it up? Or doesn't reflect how many others suffered less visible, but equally damaging discrimination?" The chairman faltered as Grace wheeled herself forward. "Mrs. Waugh, Shigan Marshall, no one denies your unfortunate accident, but accident." Sophia stood from her place in the crowd. "I have documentation of Beth Thompson's pattern of discrimination, signed off by members of this board." She held up a thick folder. "Including you, Mr. Wilson." Murmurs turned to outraged voices. A Hispanic mother stood up, trembling. "My son died in this hospital last year. They said his pain wasn't severe enough to warrant immediate attention. By the time they took him seriously, his appendix had burst." More voices joined in, years of suppressed experiences pouring out. A black nurse described being passed over for promotion 6 times. An Asian doctor detailed patient transfers approved by administration when white patients requested American doctors. Beth sat in the back corner, watching her professional world implode. Each testimony felt like another brick in the wall of truth that was burying her career, her beliefs, her entire worldview. The administration's response, Derek continued over the noise, was to bury complaints, alter records, and maintain what they called appropriate standards. Let me be clear, discrimination masked as tradition ends today. Board members shifted uncomfortably as Derek displayed their emails discussing maintaining the hospital's traditional character and considering neighborhood demographics in staffing decisions. This isn't just about one incident or one nurse, Grace added, her voice carrying decades of civil rights experience. This is about a system that made such incidents possible, even inevitable. From the middle of the room, Dr. Patricia Chin stood. I filed 3 complaints about patient discrimination last year. All 3 disappeared. When I asked about them, I was told to consider my future at this institution carefully. The board chairman tried again to regain control. These are serious allegations that require careful dash. No, Derek cut him off. We're past allegations. We have proof. Emails, records, testimonies. The only question now is, who will be held accountable? Beth felt eyes turn toward her. She had become the face of the hospital's discrimination, but she wasn't alone. Around the room, administrators and longtime staff members who had enabled or ignored these practices sat in uncomfortable silence. A young orderly raised his hand. Last month, I watched Beth Thompson ignore a Pakistani patient's call button for 45 minutes. When I answered it myself, she wrote me up for overstepping. He turned to face Beth directly. You said I didn't understand proper hospital protocols. Was that code for something else? Beth opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. How could she justify what now seemed so clearly wrong? The community had mobilized. Local civil rights organizations displayed their own data. Church groups shared stories from their congregations. Former patients and their families lined up to speak. Grace watched it all, her face showing both pain and determination. Change, she announced during a brief lull, comes when we stop accepting excuses and start demanding justice. Every person who walks through those hospital doors deserves equal care, equal respect, equal chance at life. Derek stood beside his mother, their shared purpose evident in their stance. The board has 2 choices, he declared. Either cooperate with a complete overhaul of hospital policies and personnel, or face legal action and public exposure of every discriminatory practice we've uncovered. Beth slipped out of the room as the meeting continued, the weight of countless lives affected by her actions and the system she'd upheld pressing down on her shoulders. But even as she left, she could hear Grace's voice, strong and clear. This is what change looks like. This is how healing begins. The days following the hospital meeting brought a flurry of activity. Derek's office had become command central where he reviewed termination recommendations while watching national news coverage of the hospital scandal. His mother's case had become a catalyst for examining healthcare discrimination across the country. The board is still resisting full termination for Beth, his legal advisor reported, shuffling through documents. They're worried about wrongful termination lawsuits. Derek's laugh was bitter. Wrongful termination? We have video of her dousing my mother with acid. We have years of documented discrimination. What more do they need? A knock interrupted them. Sophia entered, carrying more files. You need to see this. Beth's supporters are organizing. Some of the older staff members are claiming this is a witch hunt against traditional medical values. Outside the hospital, protesters had gathered. One group demanded justice, carrying signs with Grace's photo and stories of discrimination. The other, smaller but vocal, defended what they called medical standards and traditional patient care. In her hospital room, now recovered enough to sit up comfortably, Grace watched the coverage on her tablet. Her room had become a different kind of command center, where victims of discrimination shared their stories and community leaders planned next steps. Mrs. Washington Marshall, a young resident, said from the doorway. Beth Thompson is here. She says she wants to talk. Grace looked up, her expression unreadable. Send her in. Beth entered, her usual confident posture replaced by uncertainty. She'd aged years in the past few days, her face drawn with stress and sleepless nights. Mrs. Washington Marshall, Beth began, her voice trembling. I came to what? Grace asked quietly. To explain? To justify? Or perhaps to finally tell the truth? Before Beth could respond, Derek appeared in the doorway. His face hardened at the sight of Beth near his mother. What are you doing here? Let her speak, Grace said, raising a hand to calm her son. Everyone deserves a chance to tell their truth. Beth sank into a chair, her professional facade cracking completely. I never thought. I always believed I was maintaining standards, professional standards. But now I see. What do you see? Grace pressed, her voice firm, but not unkind. That standards was just a word we used, Beth whispered. A way to justify, to make it seem reasonable when we treated some people differently than others. A hospital administrator appeared at the door, looking anxious. Beth, the board wants to see you. They're preparing a statement defending hospital practices, and they need dash. No, Beth interrupted, straightening in her chair. I won't help them hide this anymore. Derek stepped forward. What are you saying? I'm saying I'll testify. Beth replied, her voice growing stronger. About everything. The policies, the cover-ups, the unofficial rules about who gets treated how and when. All of it. The administrator's face paled. You can't. Think about your career, your reputation dash. My reputation? Beth stood, turning to face him. My reputation is already destroyed. But maybe I could do one right thing. Maybe I can help fix what I helped break. Grace watched this exchange with keen eyes, noting every shift in Beth's demeanor. Why now? She asked. What changed? Beth turned back to Grace, tears forming in her eyes. I haven't slept since the accident. Every time I close my eyes, I see faces. Patients I dismissed. People I hurt. Lives I might have cost with my standards. And then I think about what happened to you, and I realize I'm not who I thought I was. I'm not who I want to be. A commotion in the hallway drew their attention. News cameras had somehow made it past security. Reporters called out questions, their voices overlapping. Mr. Marshall, will you be pressing charges? Nurse Thompson, how do you respond to allegations of systematic racism? Mrs. Washington Marshall, what changes are you demanding? Derek moved to close the door, but Grace stopped him. No, she said. Let them in. Let them see what reconciliation looks like. Let them see how change begins. Beth stood, uncertainty crossing her face. I should go dash, stay, Grace commanded softly. If you're ready to tell the truth, then tell it to everyone. Show them what accountability really means. The room filled with cameras and microphones. Beth looked at Grace, then at Derek, then at the gathering crowd. 20 years of justifications, of subtle cruelties masked as professionalism, of systemic discrimination disguised as standards. All of it had led to this moment. She stepped forward, facing the cameras, and began to speak. The hospital auditorium had never been so crowded. Every seat was filled with people standing along the walls and sitting in the aisles. Local news cameras lined the back wall, their red lights blinking like artificial stars. The air was thick with tension and expectation. At the center of the stage sat a long table. On one side, Derek and Grace, flanked by civil rights attorneys and community leaders. On the other, the hospital board members, their expensive suits and rigid postures a stark contrast to the diverse crowd before them. Beth Thompson sat alone at a smaller table between the two groups, a symbolic position that matched her new role. Neither defender nor accuser, but witness to a broken system she had helped maintain. This emergency meeting of the Memorial Hospital Board, Chairman Wilson began, will address recent allegations of dash. Not allegations, Derek cut in, his voice firm. Facts, evidence, truth. Grace wheeled herself forward, her presence commanding attention despite her seated position. The bandages on her arm were still visible, a physical reminder of what had brought them all here. Before we begin, she said, I want everyone to understand what's at stake. This isn't just about policies or procedures. This is about lives, human lives. One by one, people began to stand in the audience. A Middle Eastern man held up a photo of his deceased wife. She came here with chest pains. They said she was being dramatic. It was a heart attack. A Latino nurse stood next. I reported discrimination against patients 17 times. Each report disappeared. More stories poured out, a flood of testimony that could no longer be contained. The board members shifted uncomfortably as their carefully constructed facade of professional standards crumbled under the weight of human truth. Then Beth stood up. I've worked here for 20 years, she began, her voice shaking but growing stronger. In that time, I've won awards for maintaining what we called high standards of care. But now I understand what those standards really meant. She pulled out a thick folder. This contains every incident I can remember where I treated patients differently based on their race or ethnicity. Times I delayed care, dismissed complaints, or altered records. Times I taught younger staff to do the same. Chairman Wilson leaned forward. "Ms. Thompson, I must advise you dash." "No," Beth interrupted. "You've been advising me for years. Advising all of us how to maintain the hospital's traditional character. How to keep certain patients away without openly turning them away. How to make some people feel unwelcome while maintaining plausible deniability." A gasp rippled through the crowd as Beth placed another folder on the table. "These are emails from board members, including you, Mr. Wilson, explicitly discussing how to maintain what you call demographic balance in patient care." The board members erupted in protests, but their voices were drowned out by the crowd's reaction. Phones recorded every moment, broadcasting the truth live across social media. "When I burned Mrs. Washington Marshall with acid," Beth continued, her voice crack. "King, it was an accident. But everything that came after, the cover-up, the threats, the altered records, that was just business as usual. That was the system working exactly as it was designed to work." Grace wheeled closer to Beth. "And why are you telling us this now?" Beth turned to face her, tears streaming down her face. "Because I can't sleep. Because every time I close my eyes, I see faces, hundreds of faces of people I hurt, people whose pain I dismissed, whose lives I treated as less valuable. Because the acid that burned you also burned away my illusions about who I am and what I've done." Derek stood, facing the board. "We have a choice to make. We can tear this whole system down and rebuild it with real equality, real dignity for all patients. Or we can let the courts and the media do it for us." Chairman Wilson sputtered. "You can't just dash." "Yes, we can," Grace interrupted. "And we will. Because while you've been protecting your positions and your prejudices, people have been dying. Real people, with families and dreams and rights." The crowd erupted in support, their voices unified in demanding change. Reporters scribbled frantically, cameras whirred, and social media exploded with real-time updates. Beth remained standing, her posture straight, but her hands trembling. "I'm ready to face the consequences of my actions," she said. "All of them. Because the only way to fix this system is to expose how it really works." As the meeting dissolved into chaos, with board members attempting to maintain control while community members demanded immediate action, Grace watched it all with the wisdom of someone who had seen many such moments of transformation. "Remember this," she said, her voice carrying over the noise. "Change doesn't come from hiding truth. It comes from facing it, no matter how painful that might be." The hospital auditorium fell silent as Derek took the podium for the final time that evening. The energy had shifted from chaos to anticipation, from anger to the possibility of transformation. Grace sat beside him, her presence a reminder of both injustice and hope. "Before I make this announcement," Derek began, "I want everyone to understand something. My mother's injury brought us here, but this moment is about much more than one incident." He paused, looking directly at Beth Thompson, who sat quietly in the front row. "Ms. Thompson, please join us on stage." Beth rose slowly, her usual confidence replaced by a humble awareness of the moment's gravity. As she walked to the stage, hundreds of eyes followed her movement, some hostile, others curious, a few understanding. "I've spent the last hour conferring with our legal team and the board," Derek continued. "Based on Ms. Thompson's full confession and cooperation, along with the evidence she's provided about systematic discrimination at Memorial Hospital, we've reached several decisions." Grace wheeled forward, taking Beth's trembling hand in her own, a gesture that sent murmurs through the crowd and brought tears to Beth's eyes. "First," Derek announced, "effective immediately, the entire hospital board is dismissed. Their roles in perpetuating discriminatory practices are well documented, and their positions are forfeit." Former Chairman Wilson stood to protest, but was met with such a thunderous response from the crowd that he sank back into his seat. "Second," Derek continued, "Ms. Thompson has agreed to resign from her position." He held up his hand to quiet the approving murmurs. "However, before she leaves, She will work with our newly formed Ethics and Equality Committee to document every discriminatory practice she witnessed or participated in during her 20 years here. This testimony will be crucial in rebuilding our institution. Beth stepped forward to the microphone, her voice thick with emotion. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness," she said, "but I hope my actions now can help prevent others from suffering what I caused." Grace squeezed her hand. "Healing begins with truth," she said, her voice carrying across the silent room. "And truth begins with courage." Derek pulled out a thick document. "Third, I'm announcing the creation of the Grace Washington Marshall Initiative for Healthcare Equality. This program will transform Memorial Hospital into a model for inclusive, equitable healthcare." The crowd erupted in applause, but Derek wasn't finished. "My mother," he continued, voice breaking slightly, "taught me that real change isn't just about punishing wrong. It's about creating right. So this initiative will include." He began listing points: mandatory anti-bias training for all staff, a diverse oversight committee with community representation, new hiring practices to ensure staff diversity at all levels, regular audits of patient care statistics by race and ethnicity, a patient advocacy office with real power to investigate complaints, scholarships for minority students pursuing medical careers, partnership programs with community organizations. As Derek spoke, Beth felt the weight of her actions transform from a burden of guilt to a responsibility for change. She had become both a symbol of the old system's failures and a testament to the possibility of transformation. Grace took the microphone. "I've spent my life fighting for civil rights," she said, "and I've learned that the hardest changes aren't in laws or policies, but in hearts and minds. Today, I've witnessed that kind of change." She turned to Beth. "You caused me physical pain, but you've chosen to help heal a deeper wound. That takes courage." Tears streamed down Beth's face as she addressed the crowd. "I can't undo what I've done, but I can help ensure it never happens again. Every practice, every unwritten rule, every subtle form of discrimination, I'm documenting all of it. Because sunlight is the best disinfectant." Derek announced the final decision. The board members who actively participated in discrimination will face legal consequences. But our focus isn't on punishment, it's on transformation. Memorial Hospital will become what it always should have been, a place of healing for everyone. As the meeting concluded, Grace, Derek, and Beth stood together on stage, an unlikely trio united by truth and transformation. The image would appear on front pages across the country, becoming a symbol of how institutions can change when truth is faced and justice is pursued with wisdom rather than vengeance. Outside, the evening sky had cleared after days of rain. As people left the auditorium, many stopped to share their stories with Grace or to thank Derek for his leadership. Some even approached Beth, not with forgiveness exactly, but with recognition of her choice to help dismantle the system she had once upheld. Grace watched it all, her injured arm healing much like the institution itself. Slowly, painfully, but with hope for recovery. "Remember this moment," she told her son. "This is how change happens, not in grand gestures, but in human hearts choosing truth over comfort, justice over tradition, healing over hate." The story of Memorial Hospital would become a case study in institutional transformation, proving that even the deepest wounds can lead to healing when truth is faced with courage and justice is pursued with wisdom.